There is a specific look that crosses someone's face in the exact moment they realize the person they assumed would always be there has finally genuinely run out of patience. Not performed exasperation, not a temporary huff destined to pass by morning, but real, settled fatigue that no longer bends the way it used to. If you have recently reached that point, quietly, without announcing it dramatically, I want you to understand precisely what tends to happen next inside an avoidant mind once this realization lands, because their next move is rarely random. It follows a fairly predictable sequence, and knowing that sequence in advance changes everything about how you experience whatever comes next. Let's start with what fed up actually communicates to someone with avoidant patterns, because this phrase carries a meaning for them considerably different than it might for someone with a more secure attachment style. For most of the relationship, your continued presence, even amid confusion and inconsistency, functioned as a kind of quiet guarantee, evidence that no matter how much distance they created, some baseline of your investment would remain intact. Genuine exhaustion signals the collapse of that guarantee. It tells their nervous system, often before their conscious mind catches up, that the predictable safety net beneath their inconsistency has been removed, and removal of a safety net registers as considerably more threatening than any single argument or confrontation ever could. Let's talk about the first move that typically follows this realization. A subtle intensification of attention that often surprises people who expected their fatigue to be met with continued indifference. This intensification rarely resembles dramatic pursuit. It tends to look more like small, almost testing gestures. A slightly longer message than usual, a question about your day delivered with more apparent interest than recent patterns would have predicted, an unprompted mention of future plans that includes you specifically. These gestures function, whether consciously or not, as a kind of probing, checking whether your exhaustion has genuinely solidified or whether it still contains enough flexibility to be softened through minimal effort. Let's talk about why this probing tends to remain fairly minimal at first, rather than escalating immediately into more significant effort. Avoidant patterns generally favor the smallest possible investment capable of producing the desired result, a habit built through considerable prior experience where minimal gestures reliably restored your engagement before genuine exhaustion had accumulated to this degree. This first move essentially tests whether the old formula still works, small effort, restored engagement, without requiring the more significant vulnerability that genuine repair would demand. Let's talk about what typically happens when this minimal probing fails to produce its expected effect, because your response here often determines everything that follows. If genuine fatigue holds steady, if the small gesture gets acknowledged politely but does not restore your previous level of investment or previous willingness to overlook inconsistency, something considerably more significant tends to shift internally on their end. The minimal formula having failed forces recognition that something structural has changed, not just your mood on a particular day, but the underlying architecture of how much continued tolerance remains genuinely available. Let's talk about the second move that commonly follows this recognition: increased vulnerability. Sometimes the most vulnerability you have witnessed throughout the entire relationship. This might include acknowledgement of specific behavior they previously denied or minimized, references to their own fear of closeness, occasionally even direct mention of their own awareness that their patterns have caused genuine harm. This increased vulnerability often feels remarkably significant when it arrives, precisely because it contrasts so sharply with whatever guardedness characterized the relationship up to this point. Let's talk about how to interpret this vulnerability without either dismissing it entirely or trusting it uncritically, because both extremes risk missing important, accurate information available within this particular moment. Genuine vulnerability, arriving specifically in response to fear of losing you, still carries real significance, evidence that considerable internal disruption has occurred, evidence that your exhaustion genuinely registered as significant rather than as something easily dismissed. What this vulnerability does not yet confirm is whether it represents sustainable, lasting change or a temporary opening that will close again once your engagement has been sufficiently restored. Let's talk about the specific test worth applying here, watching not simply whether vulnerability appears, but whether it continues once some reassurance has been offered in response. If vulnerability persists, deepens, and extends into ordinary non crisis moments rather than only appearing during this acute period of fear, this suggests something considerably more durable than a temporary reaction to threatened loss. If vulnerability recedes the moment your engagement noticeably increases again, reverting back toward previous patterns of guardedness and inconsistency, this suggests the vulnerability functioned primarily as a strategic response to crisis, rather than as genuine, lasting transformation. Let's talk about a third possible move worth examining, one that occurs less frequently, but deserves acknowledgement nonetheless: defensive escalation, rather than increased effort. Some avoidant individuals, upon recognizing genuine exhaustion on your part, respond not with increased vulnerability, but with intensified distance, essentially preempting the loss they sense approaching by withdrawing further rather than risking the vulnerability that repair would require. This response often stems from a particular kind of protective logic. Better to control the ending through withdrawal than to risk vulnerability that might not succeed in preventing loss anyway. Let's talk about how to distinguish this defensive escalation from genuine indifference that might indicate the relationship has simply run its course, regardless of how it concludes. Defensive escalation typically includes inconsistency, even within its own apparent coldness. Moments of apparent detachment interrupted by evidence of continued monitoring or continued investment through indirect channels. Genuine indifference tends to be considerably more consistent, a settled absence of continued engagement in any form, direct or indirect. Recognizing which pattern you are actually witnessing offers useful information about whether continued patience might eventually reveal something worth engaging further. Let's talk about what remains most important throughout whichever of these moves you happen to witness: your own continued stability rather than accurate prediction of their next specific behavior. Whether they respond with minimal testing gestures, genuine vulnerability, or defensive withdrawal, your own well being depends considerably more on maintaining your own groundedness than on correctly forecasting which pattern will emerge. This groundedness means neither collapsing back into previous patterns of endless patience the moment any positive signal appears, nor becoming so hardened that genuine change, should it eventually occur, gets dismissed prematurely without adequate consideration. Let's talk about the specific danger of allowing hope, once reactivated by any of these responses, to override the accumulated wisdom that led you to genuine exhaustion in the first place. Hope reactivated too easily risks recreating the exact cycle your fatigue was meant to interrupt, extending patience again based on minimal evidence, only to find yourself exhausted once more after the initial promising signals inevitably fade. Protecting against this requires deliberately slowing your own response, allowing considerably more time and considerably more consistent evidence to accumulate before genuinely trusting that anything fundamental has actually shifted. Let's talk about what genuine, sustainable change would actually require in order to justify renewed investment on your part, given how significantly depleted your patience has already become. Genuine change requires consistency extended across weeks and months rather than days, requiring proof considerably more substantial than whatever minimal or even significant gestures might have followed your initial exhaustion. It requires accountability that persists even once the immediate threat of losing you has passed, rather than accountability offered only during acute crisis and abandoned once security has been sufficiently restored. It requires initiative on their part, moving proactively rather than only reactively in response to your continued withdrawal. Let's talk about what happens to your own sense of power throughout this entire process. Power considerably more valuable than simply predicting which move comes next. Genuine power here comes from recognizing that you no longer require their specific response in order to determine your own path forward. Whether they choose minimal testing, genuine vulnerability, or defensive escalation, your own exhaustion, once genuinely reached, does not require reversal simply because they eventually notice it and respond in some particular way. You retain complete authority over how much weight any particular response carries, and complete authority over whether continued investment genuinely serves your own well being, regardless of which specific pattern emerges. Let's talk about the specific physiological experience many people report during the earliest days after their own exhaustion has genuinely settled in, because this shift often carries a distinct bodily quality worth naming directly. Where anxious anticipation once produced a familiar tightness, a persistent low grade alertness, scanning constantly for signs of their mood or availability, genuine exhaustion often produces something closer to heaviness, a kind of settled fatigue that no longer activates the same urgent, anxious energy. This physical shift matters considerably because it often precedes full conscious recognition that something fundamental has changed. The body registering depletion before the mind has fully articulated what that depletion means for the relationship's future. Let's talk about how this genuine exhaustion differs from the temporary frustration that might arise during any single difficult conversation or any single disappointing interaction, because confusing these two states can lead to premature conclusions in either direction. Temporary frustration typically fades relatively quickly, especially once some reassurance or explanation arrives. Genuine exhaustion, by contrast, tends to persist even through reassurance, remaining present as an underlying baseline regardless of individual positive moments that might occur along the way. If reassurance from them still manages to fully dissolve your fatigue each time it appears, this suggests exhaustion has not yet reached the genuine, settled threshold being described throughout this discussion. If reassurance provides only temporary relief before the underlying fatigue reasserts itself, this suggests you have likely reached something considerably more significant and considerably more durable. Let's talk about what specifically makes this particular threshold so difficult for avoidant partners to detect accurately, especially in its earliest stages, before it becomes fully unmistakable. Avoidant individuals often become accustomed, through considerable prior relational experience, to reading partner frustration as a temporary, cyclical state, something that predictably rises and then predictably resolves once minimal effort gets offered. This learned expectation means genuine, settled exhaustion frequently goes unrecognized initially, mistaken for simply another instance of the familiar cycle, rather than representing a genuine structural shift. This misreading often explains why their first response tends to remain so minimal, calibrated according to an outdated understanding of what typically works to restore your engagement. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own internal narrative once you recognize that genuine exhaustion has settled in. A narrative shift worth examining directly, because it often provides considerable relief even before their response has been observed at all. Many people report a kind of quiet clarity accompanying this recognition, less confusion about what they need or deserve, less second guessing about whether their frustration is reasonable, replaced instead by settled confidence regarding what has actually been occurring throughout the relationship's history. This clarity, developed independently of their eventual response, represents genuine progress worth acknowledging on its own terms. Let's talk about the specific role self-trust plays throughout this entire sequence. Self-trust that becomes considerably easier to maintain once genuine exhaustion has replaced the more anxious, uncertain earlier stages of frustration. Where earlier frustration might have included considerable self-doubt, wondering whether your reaction was proportionate or whether you were somehow contributing unfairly to the relationship's difficulties, genuine exhaustion tends to arrive alongside greater confidence in your own perception. This confidence, once established, tends to remain relatively stable, regardless of whichever specific response they eventually offer, providing a considerably more solid foundation from which to evaluate whatever comes next. Let's talk about what it means to communicate this exhaustion honestly, should you choose to name it directly, rather than allowing them to discover it purely through behavioral shift alone. Direct communication might sound like simply calmly stating that you have reached a genuine limit, offered without extensive justification or extensive emotional escalation, simply honest information about where you currently stand. This directness, when offered, tends to produce more genuine, useful information about their actual capacity for accountability than indirect behavioral signals alone might provide. Though either approach, direct communication or simply behavioral shift, offers valid, legitimate paths depending on your own comfort and your own specific circumstances. Let's talk about what remains available to you specifically once you have moved through this entire sequence. Genuine exhaustion recognized clearly, their response observed patiently. Whichever move they ultimately choose evaluated honestly against the standard of sustained, meaningful change rather than temporary reaction. What remains available is considerably more clarity than existed during earlier, more confused, and more anxious stages of this relationship. What remains available is genuine confidence in your own capacity to recognize your own limits and to honor them consistently, regardless of how compelling any particular response from them might feel in the moment it arrives. And what remains available, perhaps most significantly, is complete freedom to choose whatever path genuinely serves your own well being, informed by everything you have now learned throughout this difficult but ultimately clarifying process. Let's talk about what mutual friends or family sometimes observe during this particular period. Observations that can provide useful outside perspective even though they should never fully replace your own direct assessment. People close to the situation but slightly removed from its daily intensity often notice shifts in the avoidant partner's behavior or demeanor before those shifts become fully obvious within direct interaction. Comments about seeming more subdued, more preoccupied, occasionally even direct mentions of concern about losing the relationship voiced to others rather than to you directly. This kind of secondhand information deserves the same measured skepticism applied throughout every stage of this process, useful as an additional data point, but never sufficient on its own to override your direct, sustained observation. Let's talk about the specific way this entire sequence, exhaustion recognized, response observed, evidence weighed carefully over time, tends to influence your capacity for similar discernment in future circumstances. Whether within this relationship's continued evolution or within entirely different relationships you might eventually navigate. Having lived through this particular sequence once, understanding directly how minimal testing gestures differ from genuine vulnerability, how genuine vulnerability differs from vulnerability offered purely in reaction to crisis, and how defensive escalation sometimes masks genuine internal disruption. You carry forward considerably sharper capacity to navigate similar dynamics with greater confidence and considerably reduced confusion. Let's talk about a specific pattern worth naming directly. What happens when their chosen response shifts more than once across the following weeks, moving perhaps from initial minimal testing into genuine vulnerability, then unexpectedly back toward defensive distance once your engagement seemed to stabilize somewhat? This oscillation, confusing as it feels while living through it, actually provides valuable information in its own right, suggesting that whatever internal shift is occurring remains genuinely unsettled, still moving between old patterns and emerging new capacity rather than having consolidated firmly into one consistent direction. Recognizing this oscillation as part of a genuine, if incomplete, process, rather than as evidence of manipulation or bad faith, allows you to maintain measured patience without either premature dismissal or premature relief. Let's talk about what it means to remain curious rather than anxious while observing this oscillation unfold. Curiosity that allows you to notice patterns clearly without becoming destabilized by each individual fluctuation. Anxious observation tends to treat every shift as urgent, requiring immediate interpretation and immediate emotional response. Curious observation, by contrast, allows the fuller pattern to reveal itself gradually, trusting that sustained observation over meaningful time will eventually clarify what any single moment, however dramatic or however disappointing, cannot fully determine on its own. Let's talk about the specific value of continuing to invest in your own healing and your own separate life throughout this entire observation period, regardless of which particular move they currently happen to be making. Your own therapeutic work, your own friendships, your own personal goals. None of these require pausing while you wait to see how this situation ultimately resolves. Maintaining this continued investment protects you from the kind of narrowed focus that leaves your entire emotional world contingent on their next move, ensuring that whatever they ultimately decide, your own life continues moving forward with genuine richness and genuine meaning independent of the specific relationship's eventual outcome. Let's talk finally about what patience genuinely means once you have reached this particular threshold. Patience that differs meaningfully from the earlier, more boundaryless patience that likely characterized much of the relationship's earlier history. This patience involves genuine openness to whatever authentic change might eventually develop, extended without pressure or artificial urgency, while simultaneously maintaining firm internal limits regarding how much continued waiting your own well-being can reasonably sustain. This balance, patient but bounded, hopeful but grounded in actual evidence rather than wishful projection, represents the genuine wisdom this entire sequence, once fully understood, ultimately makes available to you. Let's talk about what genuine relief sometimes feels like once you have fully accepted that their next move, whatever form it eventually takes, does not actually require your anxious anticipation in order to unfold. This relief often arrives unexpectedly, a kind of settling that comes from recognizing you have already done the difficult work of reaching genuine exhaustion honestly, and that whatever happens next belongs appropriately to them to navigate, rather than something you must continue managing or predicting on their behalf. This relief does not eliminate genuine care or genuine hope for a positive resolution, but it does remove the exhausting sense of responsibility for outcomes that were never fully within your control to determine in the first place. Let's talk, one final time, about the quiet strength available to you simply through having reached this point at all, a point many people never reach, remaining instead trapped indefinitely within cycles of renewed hope and renewed disappointment that never resolve into genuine clarity. Your exhaustion, however uncomfortable it feels, represents hard-won wisdom, built through direct experience rather than theoretical understanding alone. Trust that wisdom fully as you continue watching, patiently but not indefinitely, for whatever genuine evidence eventually emerges regarding this relationship's true capacity for the consistency and accountability you genuinely deserve. Let's talk about the specific way this entire experience, once fully processed, tends to shift what you consider genuinely non-negotiable within any future relationship, avoidant or otherwise. Having reached and honored genuine exhaustion within this particular situation, you often develop clearer, earlier recognition of similar patterns should they arise in future connections, protecting you from repeating the same extended cycle of hope and depletion before recognizing what you are actually witnessing. This clarity, hard-won as it is, becomes a permanent asset, informing your relational choices considerably more efficiently moving forward than would have been possible without this specific, difficult experience to draw upon. Let's talk about what it means to hold genuine compassion for their internal struggle throughout this entire sequence, without allowing that compassion to override your own accumulated need for consistent, demonstrated change. It is entirely possible to understand deeply why their patterns developed, to feel genuine sadness that their earlier experiences taught them to fear the very closeness they may now be realizing they have lost, while still maintaining firm clarity that understanding their struggle does not obligate you to continue absorbing its ongoing impact indefinitely. Compassion and boundaries remain fully compatible throughout this entire process, each supporting rather than contradicting the other. Let's talk about what specific self-care deserves particular attention throughout this waiting period, given how emotionally demanding, sustained, patient observation genuinely proves to be over time. Prioritizing adequate rest, maintaining connection with supportive people who understand your situation without judgment, and continuing to engage fully with activities that bring genuine satisfaction, independent of this relationship, all support your capacity to remain grounded, rather than becoming depleted by the ongoing uncertainty this entire process inevitably requires you to tolerate. Let's talk about what it ultimately means to trust yourself fully throughout this entire unfolding process, trusting that you will recognize genuine change if it eventually arrives, and trusting equally that you will recognize its absence honestly, rather than continuing to search for evidence that simply is not there. This dual trust in your own perceptiveness and in your own honesty with yourself represents the genuine foundation from which everything else discussed throughout this conversation actually becomes possible to navigate well. Let's talk about what remains genuinely true, no matter which specific move they ultimately choose to make in response to your exhaustion. Their next move belongs to them. Your next move belongs entirely to you, informed by whatever they choose, but never fully determined by it, protected by everything you have already learned throughout this considerable, difficult journey toward the genuine clarity you now possess. Let's talk about one last important reminder worth carrying forward from this entire discussion: that reaching genuine exhaustion after extending considerable patience does not make you cold, does not make you unloving, does not undo whatever genuine care you carried throughout this relationship's entire history. It simply makes you someone who has finally, honestly, arrived at your own limit, a limit every person deserves to have honored, regardless of how much they once hoped that limit would never need to be reached at all. Let's talk about the quiet dignity available in simply allowing this process to unfold at its own honest pace, without forcing resolution before genuine evidence has had sufficient time to reveal itself clearly, trusting fully that whatever conclusion eventually emerges will be one you can stand behind completely, built on truth rather than on rushed hope or premature despair. Let's talk finally about the version of peace that becomes available once you fully release the need to control or predict their next move entirely, choosing instead to remain rooted in your own truth, patient with the unfolding process, and genuinely at ease with whatever honest answer eventually reveals itself through their sustained behavior over time. That peace, once found, remains yours permanently, regardless of anything else that happens next. Let's talk about what it means to carry this understanding forward into ordinary daily life, not as a constant preoccupation, but simply as quiet background confidence that supports you through whatever unfolds, allowing genuine presence in the rest of your life, even while this particular question remains for now still genuinely open and still genuinely unresolved. And so, if you have recently reached the point of genuine exhaustion within a relationship marked by avoidant inconsistency, and if you now find yourself watching carefully for whatever comes next, trust that your own fatigue, however it eventually gets received, was never something requiring their permission or their particular response in order to be valid. Whatever move follows, testing, vulnerability, or withdrawal, remains simply information, useful for your continued assessment, but never powerful enough to override your own accumulated wisdom about what this relationship has already taught you through considerable, difficult experience. Your exhaustion earned its place honestly. Let it continue guiding you, regardless of whatever they ultimately decide to do in response